mention a receptive aspect of aesthetic experience, which is again a very partial take on this complex, multi-layered notion. So, for sake of our reductionist approach, we will focus on aesthetic experience. And there's a tentative definition: the response to perceptual objects consisting of the embodied simulation of the action, emotion, sensation that the content of the object evokes in the beholder, together with the memory such activation triggers. Such experience is not necessarily confined to the appreciation of artworks, although it grounds it. And in a way, we are challenging what I like to call the visual imperialism that reigns so far in this domain. So normally when we think about vision, we think that vision is the outcome of the working of the visual part of our brain. While there is enough empirical, and this is a standard way of portraying vision that you find in every good neuroscience manual, however, there's plenty of evidence forcing us to adopt a different view about vision, about everything, I would say, about the brain. But let's focus on vision. Observing the world and artworks in particular is a more complex enterprise than the mere activation of the visual brain, as it implies a multimodal notion of vision. Observing the world encompasses the activation of somatosensory, emotion-related components within the more general frame of the intrinsic pragmatic nature of every intentional relation with the world. My idea is that intentionality, when used in the phenomenological term, has its roots in the aboutness of action, so to speak. So with David Friedberg, we put forward a very simple hypothesis, namely that when you have a mimetic content in an artwork, part of your experience of that content is made of the embodied simulation of that content. So if you go to Bologna, Via degli Orefici, and you see Il compianto sul Cristo morto, so you see the statue of the mother of Jesus with her face disfigured by pain. It's almost like a Brechtian silent cry. You feel something. Why? How? The idea is partly because you induce this kind of simulation mechanism. And even when you contemplate a static image, there is plenty of evidence showing that that static image of portraying an action leads to the motor simulation in the observer brain. And the more dynamic is the static image of an action, the more heavily your motor system is activated, as shown by this EEG paper by Alicia Amado Proverbio in Milan. Okay, there's nothing new. This is a very important book, I think. The Problem of Form in Figurative Art by Adolf von Hildebrand. Probably not a great sculpture, but he had very interesting ideas on aesthetic. The aesthetic value of artworks would reside in their potential to establish a link between the intentional creative acts of the artist and their reconstruction on the side of the beholder. And this is the second hypothesis we put forward with David in our paper in 2007. The felt effect of particular gestures involved in producing artworks constitute a consistent component of our aesthetic experience and appreciation of artworks. And very quickly, I'm coming to the conclusion, we decided to start not with mimetic art, but with Lucio Fontana's cuts. Here is Lucio Fontana in his atelier. This is one of his cuts. And this is the paper. We show the digital version of the cuts on the left, and then as control stimuli, we removed the dynamic component. So we removed the shade that gives you the image of the invagination of the canvas, and replaced the cut with a line, with a black line of the same length and width as the cut. These images were randomly alternating on the computer screen. We never mentioned artwork, aesthetic experience, The only instruction to participants was, please look carefully and try not to blink, as usual. And these are the results. Only the original cuts were able to induce an activation of the motor system of the beholders. And I must add that the artistic quality of those cuts probably plays no effect in evoking this effect. We could have shown cuts done by myself. Although the director of the Pecci Museum said you can cut a canvas 1,000 times, but you will never produce the cuts that Lucha Fontana did. But anyway, the artistic nature of those cuts is not relevant for what I'm about to say. What I'm about to say is that when you contemplate those cuts, a component of your experience is also the embodied simulation of the gesture that produced those cuts. And we were simultaneously recording the EMG, the activation of the muscles of the beholder, the muscle that normally would be activated if you would cut the canvas yourself. And as you can see, the muscles were completely silent. So we are dealing with an activation of part of your motor system that does not produce any movement. So it's a motor simulation, clearly. So, and another interesting result is that it turned out that visual familiarity with those images played no role. The very same effect was induced in part of the participants who, at debriefing, we asked them many questions afterwards, aesthetic judgment, sense of implied movement, familiarity, and we were not able to spot any significant difference in relation to the familiarity with the images. It doesn't matter if you know who Lucha Fontana is or if you don't, you will get exactly the same identical effect in your brain. Okay, so the cuts on the canvas are the visible traces of goal-directed movements incapable of activating the relevant motor areas in the observer brain, and very quickly, with a more sophisticated way of analyzing data, source localization and ERP, we replicated the results and added more to the picture by using the artworks of another artist, Franz Klein. In this case, control stimuli on your right were produced by removing the dynamic component of the paintings, like the brush strokes and the drippings, trying as much as possible to maintain the static complexity of the images. And we found a negativity between 260 and 328 milliseconds, evoked specifically by the observation of the original artwork, but not by the control stimuli. And this negativity has been reportedly evoked both during action execution and action observation, so we consider it to be an indirect evidence of the activation of the mirror mechanism. By means of, and that was specifically found on frontal and central electrodes. And by using source localization, we were able to show three networks: premotor and motor areas, reward-related orbitofrontal areas, and prefrontal areas. I don't like this explanation. We had many fights when we were writing the paper because it sounds too phrenological to me. We have cognition in the prefrontal cortex, reward in the... This is one possible standard way to present this data. Anyway, there were a much bigger network involved beside the motor simulation of the gesture, of course. And to know better what's going on, probably we should shift to fMRI, which is something we plan to do if money will cash in, hopefully, soon. Okay, so conclusions. Here I would like to leave it with some question. I realize I told you already probably too much, but one thing that always puzzled me is when people refer to the different phenomenal experience that you have when you enter into one of these many possible worlds, the world of fiction. Say when you read a novel, or when you watch a movie, or when you look at a painting, people say after Coleridge, what you have is a typical cognitive manipulation of your mind. You have a suspension of disbelief. So my question is this all there is when we inhabit the world of fiction, or there's something more? So, because if you think about the suspension of disbelief, in itself doesn't explain, potentially, how comes that when you inhabit some of this fictional world, sometimes the emotional impact you receive from those fictional world is higher and bigger with respect to the impact of the real world. So why are you moved by reading the story of Anna Karenina sometimes more than when you listen to a comparable story in real life? Suspension of disbelief clearly is not the solution to this question. So the idea is the following. Perhaps in aesthetic experience we temporarily suspend our grip on the world, and if you think about it, this is something Diderot wrote about. When you contemplate art, when you watch a theatrical play, you are sitting, you're still, you are in a safe environment, unless someone breaks in, but that's not you would normally expect when you sit in a movie theater or when you're reading a novel on your couch at home. So the idea is that in this particular condition you can liberate new energy and put them into the service of a new dimension that paradoxically can be more vivid than prosaic reality. So what you have is somehow a sort of, I tentatively call it, liberated embodied simulation. So aesthetic experience of artworks, more than being a suspension of disbelief, can be interpreted as a sort of liberated embodied simulation. And by that I imply that by surrendering, by lowering your guard towards the potential inherent relationship you have with the external world, you suspend that relationship with the external world, you have more resources to simulate. So we look at art from a distance of safety from which our being open to the world gets magnified. This clearly does not apply to some forms of performing arts. I once happened to go to the theater to occupy my seat, and I found a lady tied with ropes in the seat that normally was occupied by a neighbor. That lady was Judith Malina, and that was a living theater performance. And I got really surprised by this. So in this case, liberated simulation framework doesn't work. To appreciate art perhaps means leaving the world behind in order to more fully grasp it. And a similar perspective can be applied to the creative process. The artwork becomes the mediator of the sensory motor and emotional resonance that establishes between the artist and the observer, thus allowing beholders to feel the artwork in an embodied manner. And liberated embodied simulation hints potentially may provide a unified level of description, a very basic one, of both artist and beholder relation with the artwork. So what can neuroscience tell us on aesthetic experience in a word? Perhaps it can help to rediscover the role of the acting body in intersubjectivity, even if in a mediated way. The complexity of the topic of symbolic expression requires an equally complex approach, certainly not exclusively confined to an oversimplistic and mechanistic neural translation of the concepts at play. Thank you.
Thank you, Vittorio, for this. If you agree with me, basic thoughts and introduction, and what strikes me is as a person of the humanities, your thoughts are so pure that you can understand. We are not intimidated by these brain cuts, and actually we are enticed into developing other thoughts even more. So I think this is an amazing foundation. I love your visual imperative. I will tell you why, and this will be my first short reaction because I want the floor.
Shall I sit?
Yeah, please. No, we just leave the mic.
Ah.
Leave the mic.
No, I mean just to leave the floor to you.
No.
No?
Just keep it.
Oh.
You're still work. You're still at work. I love visual intelligence because I come from the auditory. I come from sound. Being in the world also through sound. You hardly mentioned that. Just if you have one thought about that aspect of our system, needless to say, if you want to address also in the aesthetic experience, also in the issue of sound. And finally, my second thought, and this, I read the paper of Franz Klein that he sent to Taba, and I already had the feeling of satisfaction. I understood it so deeply, even without being an expert on the methodology of the experiments that were done there. And I want to tell you that I will take a step further into the interpretation of that experiment, that I think that when I was looking at both versions of this visual stimuli, that I saw life and death as underlining those that my experience of something which recalls in my neurons or whatever life, and something that recalls death to that point. So I may be stepping into philosophy. That's not your field or my field. But if you have some observation about that, and then I will just turn to the floor, please.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. Indeed, when you have a dynamic form and you remove those dynamic components, the control stimuli were meant to be more static. And indeed, you can, if you like, you can draw a parallel between dynamism and life and a static form and death. Although we thought we were already daring enough in doing this experiment, and we recently started addressing how we experience different ways of filming the same scene, and I learned a lesson with these two papers. To publish the Fontana paper, it took us almost 3 years. In my field, people are very skeptical about this approach, so I learned the lesson that if you do not mention art, aesthetic experience, that saves you a lot of time and puts you in a much better situation. So the paper we recently published on camera movements, where we were confronting different ways of shooting the same scene, a static shot, a dolly shot, a zooming shot, and a Steadicam shot, we wrote two lines at the end of the discussion, and we were saying, and perhaps this might be relevant also for film theory, but it was just at the end of it, and so sometimes I'm very skeptical about the heuristic value of this approach. I want to be very sincere with you. Sometimes I have the feeling that we do not discover anything new, that everything has been told already. If you take von Hildebrand quote, he was fully aware of what we are describing using a different level of description. So I'm not yet fully convinced that I'm fully convinced that cognitive neuroscience is a necessary, not sufficient condition to shed light on the human condition. If we want to understand who we are, you can't get away with the brain-body system. You can't do it. But at the same time, that's only one part of the story. And in 1999, I was in Tucson at a conference on consciousness where I first met Alvin Goldman. And our collaboration started after a couple of margarita, discussing about simulation theory. Was explaining. I was concluding my talk by saying that cognitive neuroscience is part of the humanities because we are addressing the same questions. We are only using a different level of description, but I think it's not just the cherry on the cake that when you are at the end of your career, after a life spent investigating basic phenomena, you're close to retirement, and then you finally can address these big topics like art, ethics. I think if you are doing cognitive neuroscience, and cognitive neuroscience main goal is to understand better what does it mean to be human, this is something you must address, because if you don't address language and if you don't address art, you don't address the basic ingredients that make us different from all other living creatures. Not necessarily better, simply different. There are no symbols in the animal world. There are signs, but we are dealing with a completely different semiotics there. So I think we must do this stuff, although I'm not completely sure how much we can gain, how much novel results, how much relevant this approach can be for the humanities. But I think it's worth pursuing it, and beside all, it's the most exciting part of my work, dealing with this stuff, more than with space or objects and 3D vision.
You elegantly didn't address the issue of sound, but I will give you that.
No, you know what, you're perfectly right. I'm so fond of music that I swear to God that if there will be ever a topic I will never address experimentally, this is music. So I'm sorry. Not just because I don't love music, but because if everything you like gets into your lab, it's too much. I mean, I'm already enough obsessive and paranoid. And when I always see connection with the brain, I want to leave music out of this picture.
We will bring music back later on. Mark, please.
Yeah, I have a comment and then a question just about
If you can,
yeah,
please answer
the issue you're asking yourself, what are you giving here? I mean, if you think about it, it goes, what you're saying at the end goes all the way back to Aristotle, right? Who says, why do we enjoy why do we enjoy a play that depicts a murder when in reality we would be horrified by it, right? And this leads directly, via lots of mediation to Coleridge and so on. And in some ways, that mimetic difference of art has been understood far too cognitively, it seems to me, right? That
Like
suspend belief and so on and so forth, and what you're bringing to it is really, shifting the terrain that we would explore the entire relationship of humans and art to the motor activity, the embodied response, stuff that's taking place outside of that narrow frame of the cognitive, and it seems to me that that's incredibly important. So not only are you giving yet another account of why it is that art works in this way or something like this, but you're really shifting the terms away from the cognitive approach that has been taken by Hildebrand too, I think.
Yeah,
by
definitely.
everybody. And that seems to me to be an amazingly important move, that may have much greater consequences for what we consider to be art and how we understand art. And I think it bears on sound as well, because sound is really a peripheral, it has the peripheral and the ubiquitous dimension, and the kind of, it happens alongside of doing something else. So you can be focally involved with your book or whatever, and you listen to sound, and in a certain sense, sound is a very good medium for making this kind of move, because it highlights the embodied dimension and doesn't allow for that kind of imposition of a cognitive distance that seems to be so central to art. My question then, I don't want to not let you respond to that, but my question then is, everything that you've said about art, could we also say it about thinking or about theorizing? This sort of remove from one's practical stance in the world that liberates embodied simulation to, let us entertain ideas or something like that.
Thank you. It's an excellent question, because it helps me perhaps clarifying more my point of view. I take embodied simulation to cover only one part of what we, generally speaking, refer to as cognition, or how the mind works. It's probably older phylogenetically and ontogenetically, but still doesn't explain a large part of the picture of the mind. So counterfactuals, our hermeneutic approach to the life of others. He said that, but he meant something else. He said yes, but he meant no. Why is he smiling at me while he thinks that I did something wrong? Or these sort of thoughts that occupy our mind constantly. People claim to have solved the problem by localizing this type of thoughts in a specific region of the brain. I think they were too quick in jumping on that conclusion, because the activation of those parts of the brain is not mind-reading specific. So we don't know exactly why those parts of the brain activate, when you're doing counterfactual reasoning, when you attribute false beliefs to other, while simultaneously also show sign of activation when you are sexually aroused, when you see two bodies having sex. Unless you want to convince people that your take to sex requires the ascription of false beliefs to those bodies having a sexual intercourse, but I don't think you can go much far along those lines. So the real truth is we don't know. We don't know. So we know so little about the relationship between the mind and brain. I think that at the very least, this basic ground level of intersubjectivity can be based on firmer ground than a mere correlational enterprise between what people supposedly think in the scanner, while in the scanner, or are led to be thinking by the instruction given by the cognitive scientist and the readout of the profile of their own brain activation. Here we have something that has been spotted in singing birds, in monkeys, in humans. We have a different granularity. We can describe the mechanism at the single neural level. And of course, there's a lot to be discovered, even in this very limited domain.